Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can see me. This is Brandon Garrett. I'm coming in from New Orleans today, visiting my family. Just honored today to have Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath speak with us. She's the president and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or otherwise known as BIO. And I'm going to actually turn it over to my boss, Dr. Gary Puckrin, to give you a little bit history of BIO and Dr. Heath. So, Dr. Puckrin.
Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate it. I'm really excited today about our speakers, part of our webinar series today. Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath became BIO's new president and CEO on June 1st. She's a medical doctor and a molecular immunologist by training. She just becomes the third leader of BIO since the organization's founding in 1993. She's a clinician scientist with an MD PhD in molecular immunology from Duke. Her leadership spans from the executive branch, the US Senate, the nonprofit sector, and the biopharmaceutical industry. Driven by our own family experience navigating clinical trials and funding uncertainties within the range of rare diseases, McMurry-Heath calls the distribution of science progress the social justice issue of our age. As an FDA official during the Obama administration, she was a champion of clinical trial evolution, the use of real-world evidence, and bringing the patient voice into agency decision-making. In government, she catalyzed collaborations between patients and life science leaders, creating new entities like the Medical Device Innovation Consortium and the Medical Evaluation System for Health Technology. She is a person who understands the biotech sector's unique startup culture, having played a key role in J&J's commitment to business incubation and helping to lead J-Labs in the nation's capital. The good folks at BIO point out that the I in BIO stands for innovation. I think it's evident that the career journey of BIO's new leader embodies that spirit. Again, I want to thank her very much for participating in this webinar today. And I'm going to ask Mia to introduce you finally to Dr. McMurry-Heath.
Which I'm going to do in just a couple of minutes, but I wanted to just bring, first and foremost, greetings. Hello, everybody. Really glad to be back with NMQF once again. And it's always a treat to have Dr. Puckrin on here. And if you all are in the audience are not exactly familiar with Dr. Puckrin's trajectory and overall commitment to minoritized and marginalized communities with respect to bringing in not just real world, real-time issues through platforms such as this one, but then also he's so very much on the cutting edge of what's happening or what will happen in, over time. And so Dr. Puckrin, before we dive into our conversation, I just wanted to get your impression of what we mean when we say innovation, right, in the sense of health and healthcare and really getting at health inequities.
Mia, you've hit a soft spot with me when we talk about innovation. At the National Minority Quality Forum, what we always think about is reducing patient risk. How do we get smarter and smarter to conserve lives, to reduce hospitalizations, emergency room visits, et cetera? And so innovation is really an important part of that story. And one of the really interesting pieces of today's scene is that minority populations are becoming more and more engaged in innovation. Innovation as patients in clinical trials, innovation as researchers, innovation in the sense of clinicians providing service. And so the history is really different now. The history, at least that's being written in this moment, is incredibly different. I know, Mia, you and the folks over there at AMA are really plowing new grounds in terms of opening up the medical field to make sure that everyone has access to good health care. So innovation is the absolute word.
No, I completely agree with you there, Dr. Puckrin. And I'm thinking back to you're an historian by training, right? And I want to bring in a little bit of that context here too, right? Someone you and I both admire and whose work we've studied for a long time, you longer than I, you know, and I'm okay with saying that, is Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And in his 1913 seminal text, Souls of Black Folk, he talked about how the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, right? And I would posit, and I know you would agree, that the problem of the 21st century is also the problem of the color line, right? It's just that our lines have taken on more of a virtual bend in a lot of spaces with respect to access to smart technologies for marginalized communities, and the way that might play itself out in terms of innovation. I want to get your thoughts. What does that potentially mean in the space of innovation?
So what's really different between today, at least in my mind, between today and when W.E.B. Du Bois was really pioneering in the social science world for minority populations, is that we're at the table. And being at the table means that we get an opportunity to reimagine American healthcare. Healthcare, certainly in the age of Du Bois and really to the latter part of the 19th century, was segregated. Organizations, even the AMA, has changed dramatically from the days of W.E.B. Du Bois. Hospitals are no longer segregated, et cetera. But the point is that we still haven't come full circle here in the sense of creating the opportunity to make sure that every patient who comes through the door, the healthcare door, gets optimal care. It doesn't matter about their race, their ability to pay. None of that really matters. And I think that's what certainly African Americans and those who have lived that unique history in this country are all about, is that they are driving to create a healthcare system that is open to everyone, and making sure that as we sit in the middle of this medical revolution, that no one gets left behind.
Yeah, I truly appreciate you saying that. And I know that Dr. McMurry-Heath is going to be able to really break this down for us in a granular way, right? But what would you say is foremost? We're at the table, yes, but moving forward, what has to happen for us to really pivot the conversation such that we're talking solutions-oriented innovation?
I'm always one that think culture is really important. Obviously, the operational process of delivering care is important as well. But certainly the challenge in this country, given our history, is the recognition that healthcare is a collaborative. And in that collaborative, we want to make sure that every patient has access to best modern therapy. And I think that's a policy question, that's an advocacy question, and I think each of us has to use our voice to make sure that everyone understands that the mission of the healthcare system is to make sure that everyone has access to appropriate therapy.
Well, and to your point about collaborative, how do you envision, Dr. Puckrin, NMQF being that collaborative pivotal entity between organizations that traditionally within the clinical space have not necessarily had connections, right?
So, the National Minority Quality Forum, we focused ourselves on collecting health data. Everybody has to take a stand and specialize and make a contribution. And we thought our contribution was really about gathering the numbers to make sure that when we talk about health disparities, and we often talk about it at the 10,000-foot level, maybe the national level, but we can't operationalize it down to the community level. And what we've been working on is to try to understand that healthcare collaborative that goes on down at the community level, the physicians, the hospitals, the pharmacies, the clinics, the patients, the policymakers, the social services, all of those things working together to make sure that the patient is getting optimal care, that we are all working very, very hard to reduce patient risk, and that we don't have sections or geographies in our country where we can say, in this particular community, life expectancy is being cut short because we're not provisioning healthcare in an appropriate way to that population. And so I think our speaker is just joining us. So anyway, I think that's really sort of the mission of NMQF, and we try to provide the data to drive that conversation. Good afternoon, Dr. McMurry-Heath. I think you're on mute.
We're really excited to have you, Dr. McMurray-Heath.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I think I made it just in the nick of time.
I'm so glad you're here. We're so excited to have you. I'm going to be quiet, and I'm going to let you and Mia have a conversation. And I just want to say thank you so much.
But before you go, I just have to say, you are such a hero of mine.
Oh, thank you.
And you have been really the great uncle to all of us in this field over the 20 years I've been in DC. So thank you so much for the encouraging smile when I see you.
Well, we are so excited about the work that you're doing over there in bio, and the incredible opportunities that you are creating. Maya and I were just talking about innovation, but you're leading that innovation, and that's really spectacular. And we're so proud of everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. Thank you so much, Dr. Puckrin, for your opening remarks. I think that it's just a perfect segue into what we're going to hear from Dr. McMurry-Heath. So thank you so very much for joining us, Dr. Michelle. And I am also fangirling you, right? And I followed your work for some time. Congratulations on your appointment. It's now month 3 and some change for you, right?
It's true. It's true. Mm-hmm. It's going fast and furious. That's for sure.
Okay. Well, we're going to dive into some of that, but first, we'd love to just hear from you. Set the playing field for us in terms of what you're doing and what your vision is as the new president CEO of Biotech.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's such a pleasure to be a guest speaker for your weekly webinar. The National Minority Quality Forum under Dr. Puckrin and his team has worked tirelessly to strengthen our national and local efforts to employ evidence-based and data-driven initiatives to eliminate the disproportionate burden and premature death and preventable illness for racial and ethnic minorities and other special populations. It's quite a legacy, although I know it's not over yet. So we just wanted as Bio to say thank you for your leadership in this field. And I'm incredibly honored to have been invited today to share my priorities as the new CEO of Bio. The priorities really focus squarely on science as a social justice issue. And people really ask me what I mean when I say that. And I like to think about the fact that many of the huge barriers that we face today as a society, access to clean air, access to nutritious foods, access to clean water. You just have to look at what happened in Flint, Michigan a few years back, as well as access to health and freedom from disease, have the ability to be addressed by science. And so the rate of our progress in scientific innovation and our ability to distribute that progress equitably is going to be, I think, the major lever as to whether or not we achieve social justice in my lifetime. So I think it's critically important for us to rally around how we make sure that not just the current healthcare system that we have today, but the future one that we're building is accessible to all people who need it. So these priority areas include 3 primary foci, and I'll discuss them today. And I look forward to exploring them more in detail during the chat. But first, it's this importance of science, particularly in a global pandemic. Second, it's Biotech Votes, an initiative we launched just 2 weeks ago. And third, our Bioequality Agenda, which really seeks to create a more inclusive and diverse healthcare and biotechnology ecosystem. So this spring, our world changed, and everyone gathered here today knows it, as we really faced a new reality with COVID-19. We've all rapidly adjusted our way of life, and the bioscience community, like many other communities, has worked day and night to reach that new normal. And in addition, they've been working to push the discovery of new drugs and vaccines and treatments that could really help us fight this novel disease. We at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization have a COVID tracker. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with bio, we represent over 1,000 biotechnology innovation companies in the health, agriculture, and environment space. We have large and small companies, but over 95% of our companies are small biotechs. And when COVID kicked off, we launched a COVID tracker to really keep track of how our industry was responding to the pandemic. And in the first 8 months, our companies have started over 700 novel vaccine, antibody therapy, and antiviral clinical development programs, which is simply astounding. We've never seen anything like it. So at the same time, science is a distillation of truth itself is under threat. When world-class scientists, physicians, and public servants are muzzled, or even worse, undermined for political convenience, then we as researchers, clinicians, and science advocates and health advocates must stand up for the science. If we are silent, we're contributing to the erosion of public trust in the cures that we are getting closer to every day. And this is so critically important in the context of COVID, but it's critically important every day. So as voices of reason, of science, and of patients, it's our responsibility to educate and advocate on behalf of that science. And the sad truth is that our new reality means that our failure to do so may very well cost lives. So at Bio, we believe the way out of this new reality is through science and in the form of accurate and rapid COVID testing, safe and effective vaccines, as well as effective and accessible therapies. And we also believe in partnerships between companies and health organizations, as well as partnerships between government run by elected officials who believe strongly in science and the scientists conducting the innovative research to begin with. So speaking of elected officials, 2 weeks ago, we launched Biotech Votes 2020, which is the very first time Bio has gotten engaged in a voter registration and get out the vote campaign. So our website, bio.org/votes, allows users to easily verify their voter registration and information, register to vote, and learn about the candidates specific to your geographic area in the context of science. How do they stand on the issues that are important to incentivizing and speeding scientific innovation? And we really feel that if those who care and love and wait on the science and are impacted by the science vote based upon that science, then we can really have a voice in making sure that our elected officials understand that gravity as well. So we don't care who you vote for. It is really about getting voters informed and registered, and you do not have to be a member of Bio to go to this website and get this information and use it as a tool. So we really hope that everyone will take part. So in an era in which trust is continually being eroded, it's more important than ever that all of us do everything we can to encourage our communities to make their voices heard at the ballot box. And so we at Bio are doing our part. We are closing on November 3rd, Election Day, and we are encouraging our member companies to do the same so that our employees and the 1.7 million people who work in the biotech sector can not just vote themselves, but also perhaps volunteer at polling stations and helping others get to the polls. So during this critical time for our country, one size does not fit all as far as policy solutions are concerned. And we have to make sure that the ones proposed do not exacerbate health inequalities, delay or deny access to cures and treatments, stifle the development of new medicines, and jeopardize the health and safety of Americans. The scientists and researchers at our innovative companies stand ready to support real solutions that have a meaningful impact on what patients pay for their medicines, because we know that's critically important. But we have to make sure we're doing it while still fostering a robust, innovative ecosystem. So let's just stop to think about this for a moment. If we really care about and come from communities that have a bigger burden of illness, have a worse outcome once they have those illnesses, and struggle to achieve wellness and have health security, then any scientific progress that brings solutions to those illnesses that impact our communities is a necessary goal. And the faster we achieve it, the more important it is. And I would argue that scientific research is even more important to minority communities than it is to other communities, because we bear the greatest burden of illness and disease. And so we have to be out there at the front lines advocating for science and advocating for innovation. So it's not just about making sure that we get our communities access to the medicines that are on the shelf today, but we want to make sure they have access to the innovations that are coming for tomorrow. So one current policy proposal that the current administration has put forward just in the last week would impose foreign price controls on innovators here in the US. And we really feel that that's really a reckless way to go about it, because although it may seem like a quick fix, what it really does is stifle innovation and stifle the strong ecosystem we've built in the US, and which is not available anywhere else in the world. We stifle that ecosystem's ability to produce those new innovations. And that's going to drive to greater health disparities, and because scarcity drives inequity. So I refuse to accept a system in which those who can pay and those who cannot get sicker and die. But I also refuse to accept a system in which innovation is scarce and hard to come by and expensive and unachievable. So we have to do both, and we have to keep both in mind at the same time. So in that context, this summer we launched our Bioequality Agenda, and there are 3 core pillars that we are fighting for: promote, invest, and expand. And over the next several years, we'll aggressively pursue this agenda by any means necessary through education, collaboration, and advocacy. And this agenda will challenge our companies. It will challenge the government, and it will most likely, and has already started to challenge ourselves to make diversity more than just a word or a program, but a true part of who we are and what we stand for. And I look forward into delving into the Bioequality Agenda during the next portion of the program, but know that it is core to the organization that we are building and refreshing at Bio. So when I took the helm at Bio in June, I knew our organization could not stay on the sidelines while uncertainty grew about a novel virus, skepticism in science spiked, and racial injustice was seared into our collective memory in the images of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Jacob Blake. Our industry had to seize this moment to affect change, and we had to focus on what we can do and what we should do. And by seizing this moment and creating this weekly discussion system series leading to difficult but necessary conversations about health disparities, we can all be part of the rising tide. So thank you, and I really look forward to continuing the dialogue. You can tell I get excited about these topics. I look forward to the chat, and I look forward to partnering in the coming years with all of the organizations represented on the call here today to see what Bio can do to help end health disparities.
You know, thank you so much, Dr. McMurry-Heath. I was furiously taking notes as you were talking, you know, for myriad reasons, but the more immediate reason has to do with just the agenda that you and your team are really leading on. And so I'm wondering, you know, you gave us the high level of the bioequality agenda, you know, and you broke it down between, you know, promote, invest, and expand. Can you tell us a little bit more and give us some key highlights about each of those pillars and how it fits into this moment?
Sure. And before I get started, I just have to say, It was amazing, Amanda, to read your background and to see all the incredible things you have achieved and accomplished in a relatively short amount of time, although relative changes day by day for me and probably for others. But it is just so refreshing to see, and I'm glad I'm here to cheer you on as you go along. So,
thank you. I appreciate that. I feel that here. Thank you. Likewise, likewise. Good. Don't get me into my fangirl world. I'll just have to, after the call at some point, really get on your agenda and talk some things through.
Let's do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I would love to have a longer conversation too about bioequality. Maybe we can pick your brains about some of the best ways to achieve this. I will admit that we really wanted to go out strong, but that does not mean we necessarily had nailed down all of the best strategies and approaches, because we wanted to get started and improve as we go. So we're still open to suggestions.
But sometimes that's really what you have to do. You've got to just get started.
You got to get started. So we didn't want to wait to get it perfect. We wanted to get out the door. But the 3 places we are starting is 1, focusing on health disparities through fighting for more diversity in clinical trials. And we're doing that by facilitating adding that diversity to the trials our member companies are conducting, as well as advocating for policies that will help it, and fighting for access to COVID therapies and vaccines, because we really think COVID is a crucible for these broader issues, particularly with the disparate impacts we've seen. And so if we can get COVID right, if we can do a better job with equity of the innovation when it comes to COVID, I think it can be a blueprint for how we can improve equity to innovation more broadly. And so just about a week ago, we held our first Bioequality Summit, and it was focused on how to get better access to COVID therapies. And we're studying ways we might advocate on behalf of the Medicaid system. There's lots of ideas in the hopper, but it was wonderful to see the broad cross-section of stakeholders that came to a bio roundtable to really focus on this issue. The second is promote, and that's really around the talent pipeline. Many of our member companies have had programs over the years to train and foster the development of minority scientists and entrepreneurs. I, for one, was a beneficiary of a UNCF Merck Fellowship over 20 years ago that really helped me go through my graduate career. And there's tons of these programs. But a missing link that we think we uniquely at Bio can fulfill is making the alumni of those programs visible to all of the hiring members in our thousands of biotechnology companies, making sure that they can be seen as the great candidates that they are. And so we're building a LinkedIn-like community where all the alumni of those various programs can be found. And no matter where our companies are, the individual hiring managers within those companies can see those candidates and consider them and search them, which is very important as well, being able to search them. And then the third is invest, and that's really the power of the pocketbook. So our companies, mentioned we have many small, but we also have all of the large biotechnology companies as well, that we have quite a bit of economic power through our supply chains. You think about how much a company like my former company, J&J, has to buy. They have to buy paper, they have to buy shipping, they have to buy transportation, they have to buy lab supplies, they have to buy labels, they have to buy so many different things in operating a company of 140,000 people. And we want to make sure that our companies are putting their money where their mouth is by supporting minority-owned and women-owned businesses in those supply chains. Many of our big companies have started to do this, but we want to make it easy for big, medium, and small companies to do the same by helping them identify those vendors and utilize those vendors. And then the final aspect of invest is making sure that our entrepreneurs in the minority community are getting access to the capital they need. By some estimates, Black entrepreneurs get less than 1% of the VC funding, and the unofficial numbers of minority awardees in the Small Business Innovation Grants that NIH awards is less than 0.5%. So if we think about that, I mean, that's such a vanishingly small yield of minority leaders in those areas. And yet we have great ideas, and our entrepreneurs are trained on the needs of our community. So we need to make sure that our entrepreneurs are supported with the resources they need to make their businesses viable. So those are our starting 3 pillars.
You are hitting the nail on so many nails on the head, and we're definitely going to be friends. I know that for sure. And then also, you're in such good company with the NMQF family. So I'm going to speak on their behalf if they let me to take that liberty, that they will be really very much calling on you and your membership body to build out a lot of these tenets, especially all of them are significant. I'm thinking more and more recently on that last bit of invest. So thank you for laying that out. Another tenet you talked about in your remarks has to do with trust and rapport, right? And for many of our audience members and beyond, all of us at this point are familiar with Tuskegee and other situations in which the mission to drive science has also come at the behest of the health of marginalized and minoritized folk, and particularly African Americans in this country, right? It's a powerful heavy that sits with us today, right? And so I'm wondering, for our audience and for members of minoritized communities, what would you say to them if they're considering being a part of a clinical trial, yet there's still this feeling in the back of their heads about, well, what if?
Well, I understand the concern, and I know that trust is completely ruptured when you have a situation like we had about a month ago, when the son of the famous writer Leroy Jones and the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, is putting out a public statement saying that no African Americans in Newark should participate in COVID vaccine trials. Because the industry preys upon minority people. And I'll just have to say that that is a stale, old, and an anarchic way of looking at what our industry does. If you think about many of the examples that come to mind, they're 50 to 100 years old. And 50 to 100 years ago, scientists preyed on the weak of all types. I mean, we had eugenics, we had experiments on people in mental institutions, we had a lack of informed consent to subjects of all medical and scientific research. It was barbaric. It was the Wild West, and it was barbaric. The reason we have vaccines right now is because the inventor of the very first smallpox vaccine tried it on milkmaids and himself. And I can guarantee you he wasn't informing everyone. It was a horrible point. It was a horrible point in history. But we have come completely full circle. And now we're in a situation where patients with diseases that are really threatening their quality of life or the length of their life are clamoring to be in clinical trials because they know that is the source of hope. That when you have exhausted all options, the way to get hope for your disease is to take part in a clinical trial so you can get the newest and latest innovations, and perhaps they will save your life. And yet we have not communicated to the rest of, particularly the African American community, that that is what's at stake. If you are not part of the research, you are not going to have access to the cures or even know if the cures work for you. So part of this is realizing that being a part of clinical research is now highly desirable by all populations. And so if you want to think about what we're being shut out of, we're being shut out of access to that incredible resource. But we also, I think, in the African American community have a very strong history of community responsibility and helping one another. And if we think about how COVID is disproportionately harming our brothers and sisters, then we have to stand up and say, what can I do to help? And because COVID is resulting in 3 times the mortality rate in African Americans once they have it, this is not about how you catch it, this is once you have it, as it is their white counterparts, it means that we do not know if there is a genetic component to how we as African Americans are responding to COVID. And so we are not going to know if a potential COVID vaccine works for our community unless we participate in the clinical trials. So if you want to protect your church mothers, and you want to protect your children, and you want to protect the health of the broader African American community and make sure that we are not wiped out by this plague, then step forward, volunteer, be part of the solution to make sure that what comes out of the other end works for us. Because I guarantee you, if we don't participate now, by the time a vaccine comes to market, if we haven't been part of really finding out whether it works for us, they'll just assume it works for African Americans, whether or not it does. And that is not a situation we want to be in.
You know, I have to admit, this is the first time I've ever heard anyone use the term clinical trials and hope in the same breath. Right now, I know I understand that, right? Especially if you're talking about persons with rare disease conditions, right? And I myself, I lost a very dear and close family member who to a very rare condition, right? And if there had been clinical trials, I would have certainly encouraged her to be a part of that, right? But with respect to something like COVID, you know, and to your earlier point about the science and people being so very skeptical to the science, especially because political forces have not made it easy to really navigate through all of the, you know, the information that in a lot of ways is contrarian, right? So I'm wondering, you know, if you can make this more specific to a COVID conversation, what would you then say to families who are considering the vaccine once it becomes truly viable and widespread? What would you say to them?
It's a complicated choice, and it's going to be an individual choice. And there are going to be several different vaccine technologies available. And the Center for Disease Control and the National Academy of Medicine is working very hard to come up with a paradigm of who should receive the vaccine when. You know, we want to make sure that the most vulnerable people and the most exposed people and the most essential people are getting the vaccine first. But when your number's up, when it's your turn to get the vaccine, please do. Please think about how to get it, because you're not just protecting yourself, you're protecting the person next to you as well. And if we want our community to thrive, we need to have that herd immunity within our communities as well. It can't be something that's over there, because we don't want over there to be protected and where we are not to be protected. It's so critically important. And it's interesting, the dialogue that we've heard. You know, someone quoted a Black minister the other day to me who said, well, pharmaceutical companies are coming to historically Black colleges and preying on African American youth and trying to get them involved in clinical trials. And I said, no, this is a new opportunity. When I was at medical school at Duke, we were all clamoring to be in clinical trials, and they come to majority white institutions all the time to enroll healthy volunteers, and they pay them for those studies. So we would all volunteer to make extra money to help get us through graduate school. So having that opportunity now expanded to a bigger variety of institutions is really an opportunity for more of us to benefit, more of us to participate, and for the end result to be more applicable to a wider variety of people.
To your point about the role of universities, just 2-ish weeks ago, I think, or maybe 3 weeks ago at this point, we're really big on shouting out HBCUs on this webinar. Xavier and Dillard, their presidents, sent out messages to their student body, you know, encouraging them to themselves consider being a part of clinical trials, and also once the vaccine becomes available to be vaccinated. And they admitted themselves that they have they have become a part of clinical trials and have received the vaccine, at least the one that's available now. But for you, Dr. McMurry-Heath, are you going to choose to vaccinate your family, you think?
Yes, definitely. I mean, my daughter has her appointment to get her flu vaccine this weekend, and I usually get mine with her, and I will line up when I can. I'm trained in pediatrics, so I know that vaccines are really a victim of their own success. You know, when we don't have them, the childhood mortality rates are through the roof. And when we do have them, we forget how essential they are. My father was one of 16 children born in Louisiana, and then they moved to Houston, Texas, and he was born in 1920. Only 12 of them lived to adulthood. And you think about that being pretty commonplace at that time, to expect to lose your children. And it gives me chills to think about it. And we've reached a day and age where it's intolerable to think of losing a child. But that's because we have protections like vaccines, like clean water. So we have to fight for those. We can't forget how important they are.
No, I appreciate just how vivid that story is. I think that's something that to a certain extent resonates with all of us, irrespective of the type of family we come from, the geography, and so on and so forth. But we do know that those points matter: where you live, where you work, family dynamics, you know. And a lot of times when we're talking about health inequities and health disparities, we get so caught up in the individual conversation, right? In the terms of individual behaviors, and we need to keep those in mind. But it really is at the population level, you know, so many things that impact people's abilities to make healthy choices, right? And so, to that point, I'm wondering if you can shed light on your thoughts on how minoritized and marginalized peoples here in the U.S. And I know we're talking U.S. centric right now. I would love to have a global conversation at some point. But how can members of those communities, of our communities, minimize the overall risk of healthcare inequities and disparities?
At this point, there aren't a lot of defenses. The best defense is being well informed, taking the time to get insights and ask hard questions, but it shouldn't be that hard. We should be arming our healthcare providers with the tools that allow them to treat people equally, to know when they're veering outside of treatment guidelines, to make sure that they're reminded, oh, offer that patient this option, so that we can put guardrails in place so our clinicians show less variation in how they're treating individual patients. That's important to do. But the other thing to do is to think about the promise that's going to make health and wellness easier. So we talked some about the innovations that are going to bring new medicines to help you once you're sick. But you touched upon, you know, also promoting wellness and keeping you healthy. And the technology is also amazing there. I mean, one of the things I've been so amazed about coming to bio, because I didn't know much about the agriculture world before I got here, is the science that's in the hopper to improve access to nutritious fruits and vegetables. So right now, there are companies that are trying to bring down the cost. They're using big data and artificial intelligence to bring down the cost of inserting specific genes into small crops so that we can see a huge difference. So what do I mean by that? That one of these companies has this vision, you know, we are going to be able to put more protein, more healthy protein into fruits and vegetables. We're going to be able to make them more delicious. We're going to be able to make them more able to grow in hydroponics settings, which is basically, imagine your local mall that's been closed down, converted into a hydroponic farm that doesn't need soil, but grows basically in the dark in an empty out building, and is able to produce a variety of fruits and vegetables. So if you can deliver the genetic variants of fruits and vegetables that can thrive in that setting and produce healthy and delicious foods, then it's easy to drive 5 miles down the street and deliver them to every local market in our inner city communities. So we need to be invested in how this science is going to improve the underlying health status of our communities, as well as help our communities once they're sick.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And the inner child in me and the writer in me thinks about like this whole Willy Wonka situation, right? Where we're able to do so much, you know, and I'm always very humbled by the human spirit and ingenuity and imagination, right? But to be able to harness all of that toward, to your point, toward the dispelling of inequities in health, that gets me so excited. That gets me excited. It also, you know, these are really big ideas to convey in lay terms, right? And so having people like you at the helm to make it very plain, you know, and also the fact that bio is made up of smaller entities that likely have a pulse on the communities that they directly serve, right? That is an incredible service, to be able to be there and be present, and also to ensure that, to your point, that those who your companies are looking, your membership companies are looking to impact are at the table, and a part of the decision making, a part of the hard conversations, right?
I love the verb that you just used, harness. Because if you think about it, I mean, if you think about harnessing the power of a horse, you know, or harnessing the power of the steam engine, or harnessing the power of the Industrial Revolution, all of those engines, all of those sources of power had dangers associated with them.
Absolutely.
But yet you still didn't want to be left behind, because your ability to provide for your family and protect yourselves and arm yourselves was really reliant on your ability to harness those solutions. And biotechnology is one of those engines that we as a community need to learn how to harness.
Learn how to harness, and then also learn how to, again, communicate that to people who might be skeptical, including health providers and health professionals themselves, right? So there's a question here from one of our audience members, you know, trying to glean your thoughts on how do we educate the healthcare professionals, the ones who are the trusted voices, right, with respect to getting themselves vaccinated, as they're simultaneously encouraging, you know, the public to do so.
Well, it's going to be critically important, because healthcare providers are likely to be one of the first groups called up to be vaccinated. So eyes will be on them. But I do think we need to educate our health providers to care more about cutting edge research. I was raised by two public health advocates. My mother was in public health nursing in Oakland, Alameda, and Berkeley. My father designed psychological programs for the federal government for communities that couldn't afford private care. And both of them dedicated their lives to trying to deliver care to people who needed it. But it was a little bit of anathema to them that that biomedical research could contribute to that social goal, you know, and not just to them, but to the ladies I went to church with and my broader family. It was so distant from their day-to-day lives that they didn't necessarily see how it was part of the fight. You know, you were really supposed to roll up your sleeves, deliver care, and that was going to help our communities. But it is just as important that we're in there directing the laboratory research, directing the investment in biomedical innovation, directing the questions that get asked, and by being asked, get answered, so that we're also part of that progress as well. And so I think we have a lot of wonderfully dedicated minority clinicians and health providers that are dedicated to minority communities, that see service as their mission, but because they've been so focused on the patient in front of them, which is so admirable and so wonderful, they haven't necessarily had the bandwidth or the orientation to look at the science that's coming down the pike. And yet if you're going to serve this patient in front of you, it's your obligation to be looking at the future as well.
That resonates with me so clearly, right? And I think for a number of our people in our audience, right, we want the doctor that takes time with us at the bedside, right? But to your point, we also really do want to and hope that our clinicians and providers value that that cutting edge research that will push their practice not just beyond the current science, but then also to consider some of those more upstream issues that impact our health. And you opened up so eloquently today, talking about not just the fact that this moment of COVID-19 requires innovation, but the fact that it is layered with the structural violences related to health inequities, right? So I'm wondering if you can lay out for us two things with respect to that point. How do we get physicians and healthcare providers in general involved and enticed to become clinical trial investigators? And also, what are the barriers that some of them might face, right, especially those of color? But then also, what strategies is Bio employing to use the technology, to use the innovation to not just promote the science, but to also invest in and call attention to those social justice inequities?
You know, we had a conversation last week with the head of clinical trial diversity for the National Medical Association, and he was talking about how he spent decades training minority clinicians to be principal investigators, but even after the training, they don't always necessarily participate. And he's talking a little bit about the frustration. And from being on the other side of that equation, you know, when I was at Johnson & Johnson, I led regulatory and clinical for all of our medical device companies. And so I oversaw clinical trials, you know, across the globe. And I know that your number one parameter of conducting a clinical trial is speed. How quickly are you enrolling the patients? How reliably are you getting the data back that you need? And I remember the factor that mattered most was not the individual clinician, but did that clinician's office or site of care have clinical care coordinators that could take the time to follow up the patients and do all the record keeping and do all the paperwork. That is really a huge part of being in a clinical trial. And so I think that's the primary reason why companies end up going to specialist office rather than general practitioners to conduct trials, because they're more likely to have the operating margin that allows them to have the personnel to participate in a trial. So one of the things we did is we would supply coordinators to sites if they didn't have that bandwidth themselves. But if they don't have a good IT system for their medical records, if they are not resourced to really easily interface with the companies conducting trials, then it is challenging. It is difficult. So I think we have to look at all sides of the equation and see, because this doesn't just impact minority patients, let's be clear. When you're doing a uterine cancer trial and you're only going to gynecological oncologists and you're not going to general practice OB-GYNs to look for patients for your trials, you are primarily going to get the patients with the Cadillac version of health insurance who can afford that specialized oncologist, as opposed to the OB-GYNs who see a wider cross-section of the population. So we have to make sure it's not prohibitively expensive for a clinician to participate in a trial. The other thing we have to do is fight very hard with the FDA, and I'm a former FDAer, so I also have sympathy on this side, for how they determine the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Because the comorbidities are more prevalent in minority communities. The comorbidities that usually say, oh, well, you have diabetes, so you can't be part of this trial. Oh, you have heart disease, so you can't be part of this trial. Oh, you have obesity, so you can't be part of this trial. And the FDA makes it too easy for sponsors to eliminate large swaths of the population. They want kind of the healthy sick, so that they can have an easier time understanding the data. But we have to make sure that they're only doing that when it's absolutely biologically necessary and not when it's just expedient, because we want because the reality is most patients who are going to need that resulting drug, Black or white, are going to have comorbidities. They're going to have polypharmacy. They're going to have other health issues that are impacting whether or not they respond. So we should be wanting to know whether our interventions work in those contexts.
I feel like we could go on, and we clearly have 1,000,000,001 questions in the Q&A box. So foremost, shout out to the audience for your really deeply engaging questions. I'm hoping, Dr. McMurry-Heath, that we can have you back in another time, and if that can't happen very soon, we still want to at least get these questions over to you for your consideration. So maybe Keiko can just take notes of the questions that haven't been asked today. I just want to close by asking you to give us any final words and takeaways that you want the audience to keep in mind.
Well, those of us who care about equity and have cared about equity for a long time can sometimes lose heart. It can sometimes feel like the problem is too big, or that things don't change fast enough. And I think it's important for us to remember that we're only at the point of progress we're at today because of those fighters, because of those advocates. And we have to keep up that tradition because we owe it to the people who came before us, who had a much harder fight to fight, to not lose hope and to stay dedicated.
Really appreciate that, and I hope you all take that to heart. I know I most certainly do. It's something I've been meditating on quite frequently. And on behalf of the National Minority Equality Forum, and then also to a more personal extent, I appreciate the time that you've taken with us today. And I will most certainly be reaching out to you in a formal capacity with my work at the Center for Health Equity at the American Medical Association, but then also in a more personal capacity, because these issues are near and dear to my heart, the intersection of equity and innovation. So thank you, Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath, President and CEO of Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO for short. Please, everyone, be on the lookout for the work that she and her team are doing. And otherwise, we wish you well. We hope that your family stays well. And I will pass it back over to Brandon.
Thank you.
Brandon, we can't hear you. You're saying all the good things.
But you're on mute.
There we go. Well, thanks so much for all these words of advice. I like me, I took a ton of notes. First thing we've heard, that biotech is also a social justice issue. So thank you so much for letting us know and reminding us that everything is interconnected. And so if we want a better healthcare system, we have to think of it in its totality, and not just when we were at the doctor's office or, just silo it. It's everything. Perfection is the enemy of progress is something else that you guys both mentioned. Making sure that everyone is seen, making sure that everyone is invested in, and making sure you pay it forward. Encouraging everybody to be a part of the solution. I think one thing that really resonated with me is that you stated that you yourself will take the vaccine. You will make sure your daughter takes the vaccine as well. And so not scaring everyone away from this, but making sure that, these things, yes, we realize what the horrors of the past, so we know that to move forward, we have to be a part of the process. And then in our community needs the protection too, so we can't let other communities be saved and protected without and not think of our own. So really appreciate all those tidbits of advice and just being so open with us. Thank you for being one of those. You mentioned, thanking all the advocates that came before you. We want to thank you as an advocate for fighting for us at everywhere from at the FDA to industry to probably at Duke back when you were to your parents actually for doing all they did. So we really appreciate you. And to the audience, to hear more speakers like Dr. McMurry-Heath, please join us every Friday from noon to 1 Eastern Standard Time. And additionally, sign up for our annual Summit on Health Disparities, our 17th annual Summit of Health Disparities. So Gary, as you know, Gary's been doing this for a while. We really appreciate you. Just remember to stay involved, get out there, do your census, and make sure you vote. So everyone have a good day. Thanks, man.
Bye.
All right.